Hello and good afternoon. I am so excited to welcome you to the Thursday afternoon broadcast of the Sarah Casada Live Show. This is sort of a very casual coffee-related chat with different authors and thinkers and speakers talking about issues that are important and that are meaningful to me. And so I'm so excited to have the opportunity to talk with different people. I'm going to introduce today's guest in just a minute, but I will go ahead and introduce myself as well. If you don't know who I am or haven't ever met me, my name is Sarah Casada, and I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and I am a writer and author. My book, Love Undocumented, was published in January. It's about immigration and faith. And I have something very exciting to tell you that I meant to put in the comments before this video started, but I will add it at the end, or if you're watching the replay, it should already be there. That for folks who sign up for my weekly newsletter, you will be entered to win a collection of books from the guests that have been on the Sarah Casada Live Show this fall. And so some of those include Once We Were Strangers by Sean Smucker. And I can't remember the other titles off the top of my head. I'll mess them up. So he was last week. It's fresh on my mind. But we have gotten to talk to lots of great people. So if you want to enter to win those books, there will be a link in the comments for that. But today I am so excited to introduce my friend Jen-Chi Lee. And she is a contributor to the book Voices Rising. And I'm afraid I'm going to forget the whole subtitle. So I'm just going to say Voices Rising, and you can let us know about the book in a minute. But she has written on this topic of women of color in missions, and she has done lots of interesting things. So I'm going to let her introduce herself to you. So Jen, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about where you are and a little bit about the work that you do.
Okay. Thanks for having me on your show.
I'm so glad to be here.
I am glad to be here too. So my name is Jen, and I live in Johannesburg, South Africa. I've been here for about 8 years, and I'm a part of our very little team. It's me and 2 other people here with Servant Partners. And basically, Servant Partners is an organization, missions agency that works among the urban poor. So transforming communities through mission along with the urban poor. So our ministry is generally based on kind of an approach that's incarnational. So we live and work in the places that we are ministering, and hope to kind of do everything that we do in partnership with the people we live and work with. So that's kind of the approach, and that's more or less what we've been trying to do here as well.
That's awesome. So Jen and I actually were friends in Los Angeles because were you doing Servant Partners in LA, or were you just connected to them loosely?
I was in the internship, I think, when you were there, when we were both there at the same time.
Yes, that was like a decade ago now, because we're so old and wise. But yeah, Jen was in LA at the same time, and we went to the same church, which I had actually never heard of Servant Partners, I don't think, until I went to that church, and there was a lot of folks there connected to that ministry and doing really good, fruitful work there. So thanks to social media, I've been able to follow along her stories and different things over the last 10 years. And so yeah, it's really fun to hear what you're doing in South Africa. So you gave us kind of the overarching view of kind of the mission and heart behind Servant Partners. What does that look like for you on a day-to-day basis?
It's a good question. So I think it's changed actually in the last decade, basically. So when I joined Servant Partners, I was with the internships department, which was more of kind of a training and pastoring role. And being in South Africa, we started out as a team kind of doing a lot more work in the communities that we live in and work in. At this point, we've kind of shifted because a lot of the stuff that we've been working on has been kind of handed over to local leadership. So we've taken a little bit of a step back, and we're more heavily involved in our church, which we're kind of trying to take on this journey of diversity together, of inclusion in a new way. And then in particular for me, I work with a department in Servant Partners that's focused on kind of helping us to learn and collaborate together from across our different sites. So obviously, you know, our site is here in Joburg. There's only 3 of us, but we have sites all over the world, and we're doing a lot of things in a lot of different places, and we're trying to figure out how do we actually learn from each other rather than like reinventing the wheel. So,
because I would imagine it's somewhat independent because it's kind of an organic ministry model. So that would make sense that people in different places are all kind of doing that on their own. So I could see there being a lot of opportunity and collaboration for that.
Yeah.
So if it's just the three of you guys in that city, are there other folks in South Africa or other folks in Africa that you connect with, or is it really kind of?
We are, okay, so we are currently the only sub-Saharan African site. We have a couple of other sites in other parts of Africa. They are like secret sites, so I'm not allowed to say. I don't even know if I know where they are, actually, to be honest. But there are a few others in some other areas. There used to be another team in Uganda, and then there are a couple of partner sites, but it's difficult. I mean, the reality is like Africa is a gigantic continent, and our context is really different, South Africa, compared to a lot of the other places as well. Like a big focus here is on issues of racial justice and reconciliation and land justice. And, it's a predominantly Christian context already kind of, so it's a bit of a different approach. And there are not other servant partners here, but there are many other partners that we hope to work with. So
that's great. So tell me a little bit about this book and kind of the origin story of how the book developed, and it's a compilation of contributors. So I'd love to hear also a little bit about how you got involved.
Yeah, so this book, I wish I could say for sure what the origin story is. I think basically, so Servant Partners Press is the publishing wing, I guess, or arm of Servant Partners. And the Servant Partners Press was developed specifically to kind of highlight stories that wouldn't necessarily get told elsewhere. So, some of these larger publishers might not want to hear from a no-name person, or like, feel that a no-name person's story is bankable or like financially a good investment for them. But I think we wanted to be able to tell stories that are important from people doing work in among the urban poor, essentially. And so in particular with this book, I think there was a recognition. We have a number of women of color in the organization who in some ways are kind of the backbone of a lot of the work that we've been doing. And I think we just wanted to provide a space to highlight those voices. So I think basically everyone who is a contributor has been with Servant Partners, either on staff or at one of the sites as kind of like a friend or a partner, a local partner, for at least 5 years. And yeah, so some of the women are staff, some of them are just friends, but people who've been working in this way in for a number of years.
That's terrific. How early on did you get involved, or what kind of inspired you to decide to contribute?
I think we've been working on this for like 1.5 years, maybe 2 years almost, maybe longer for the editors. And I think I got involved because I felt like the perspective that I had. So I think as an Asian American person, I felt like I am a person of color. I am a woman of color, yes, but I'm also a woman of color who is in close proximity to whiteness in a lot of ways, just because I'm East Asian, I'm privileged, educational background, middle class, all of these kinds of things. And I think in particular, I wanted to kind of bring some of that nuance of how do we understand kind of our multiple identities as women of color in mission and in ministry. So that was kind of what I was hoping to focus on in the chapter.
Yeah, well, you definitely talked about that in your essay in such beautiful and amazing ways. I actually wanted to read a quote, so I had to write it down. Actually, I have two, but let me do the first one first. Because I loved how you talked about kind of your own family's background and all of the ways that that connected to bridge building, which is such a great metaphor that you really unpack beautifully. But she said, for God's kingdom on earth to expand, there must be healing and wholeness among individuals as well as groups of people. And I feel like so often, like when I read that, I was like, yes, because I think too often we think it's one or the other. And I do think that there is a lot of opportunity for us to lean into kind of this bigger vision of God's kingdom on earth that is healing and bringing this restoration to us as individuals, but also as groups of people. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about your background and kind of and really how you anticipated that being being a way that you would become a bridge builder in South Africa.
Yeah. So in the chapter, I talk a lot about kind of being Korean and American and from Hawaii, and the reality of what that means for me. But then kind of how none of those words are associated with me here. When you first look at me, most people assume something else. But in any case, they see that I'm Asian in some way. And I think I thought, coming into it, and was sort of told by a number of people like, oh, because you're not Black, white people will hear what you have to say better potentially. And because you're not white, Black people will hear what you have to say better as well. And it'll be, this wonderful opportunity for reconciliation and bridge building, et cetera, et cetera. It was this like really glowing picture of what bridge building could look like. And I think in the chapter I talk about how, but bridges are made to be walked on. That's kind of the purpose of a bridge, is to get to the other side. And I think in a lot of ways, I had kind of a sort of self-glorified understanding of what that would mean. I think I felt like, well, the bridge is the most important part. It's very, it's crucial to these two sides coming together. And I think it took me some time to understand that the point was not, how excellent of a bridge builder I would be necessarily, but how willing I was to kind of actually place myself here and be, for lack of a better word, this is the only Christian word that's coming to my mind right now, but actually used by God, and to accept kind of the reality of what bridge building actually was, which is extremely non-glamorous, I think. So, yeah.
Yeah, when I was reading that part of the book and I was thinking about this conversation, and I have always really been drawn to that image of bridge building, of being a bridge builder. I think about it in relation to cross-cultural marriage. I think about it in raising bicultural kids, like, oh, this is going to be so great. They kind of fit in wherever they go, or they have all these different connections. And I think it's really sobering and important to remember that there's also pain in that, of kind of not necessarily fitting into different places, or, kind of the being stepped on that you talked about. That was, just a good reminder to me of like, these are not easy roles to walk into, and they're not necessarily, they don't always play out exactly like we think and hope. And so the other quote that I wrote down from you talks about a lot of the you talked a lot about the tensions of sort of the intersectionality. And if anyone's watching this hasn't heard that word before, it's sort of, well, why don't you explain it? Because you do such a good job in the book.
Okay. So intersectionality, I mean, I think it's become more popularized in like the last couple of years, or maybe more. But essentially the scholar who kind of coined the term, or the concept, who pioneered it, essentially was this woman, or is named Kimberly Crenshaw, and she was a professor, or she is a professor. And basically, she kind of talks about this experience specifically of Black women. And so she says a lot of times we feel like that the oppression essentially that Black women experience is just the sum of like Black men's experiences plus white women's experiences. And if we can understand those two, then we can understand what Black women's experiences are like. And she basically says that's false. Essentially, that when you actually look at when you actually look at the intersections of a Black woman's identities, what she experiences in terms of her oppression and in terms of her position in society is not the same as just the sum of the parts. It's something different, and and worse, essentially, or like more complex, I should say.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, so that's kind of the origin of the concept. That's like my very dumbed down version that I don't feel like I did justice to, but yeah, essentially. But I think, you know, the concept applies, I think, to a number of other people kind of, and obviously it's not just race and gender, it's, you know, your sexual and gender identity, it's political stuff, it's age, it's a bunch of other things. And so I think, you know, just being in South Africa has made me reconsider who am I and what are all of the parts of my identity and what are the parts where I experience privilege and what are the parts where I actually experience oppression or marginalization in some way. And how do I hold both of those in tension, or all of those in tension, I should say.
Yeah, I think it's really beautiful. And the way you described it now and the way you describe it in the essay is really clear to kind of see all those different ways those things are at play. And it's really helpful, I think, for someone like me reading it who's not in your shoes to kind of see that from your perspective and all the ways that impacts your experience in South Africa. One of the experiences that you share is about being propositioned on the street. Weirdly, I can relate to a lot. Not as much these days. I don't know what to make of that. But definitely having lived in urban communities basically my entire adult life, I resonated a lot with the kind of fear and frustration and anger that you expressed around some of that. And you shared an experience about praying for, you know, just a 15-minute walk home and some reprieve to that. Do you want to share a little bit about kind of that story?
Yeah, I think, so, I mean, the context was I was in the midst of dealing with a bunch of other emotional things and just feeling kind of like, I need to walk home. It's 15 minutes from, you know, my friend's house to my house. It's not very far, but it means walking through the township that we live in. And I was just, I prayed. I prayed basically before I left the house. I asked my friends to pray for me. I even texted another friend and said, please, can you pray for me? And said, look, I just want to be able to get home without having people interact with me about being Chinese, which I am not, or about being a female and what they do or don't want from me or are interested or not interested in. And so, you know, I just said, God, can you just give me this one thing? I'm not even asking for a lot. You know, I know technically you love me, so I feel like this is like a very small thing to ask, you know.
Oh, how I've had those prayers with God. Seriously, just this one little thing. It's not too much.
Yes, it's so small, and if you do this, I will believe that you love me. And I mean, like, I was struggling with my relationship with God at the time for a number of other reasons, and it just kind of felt like not necessarily an ultimatum, but just sort of like, this is such a small thing, God. I know that you can do this. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, on the walk home, I'm walking past this house, and there are like these two young guys, and obviously, I also look 12. You know. I'm not 12. I'm more than twice that, but I look I'm almost 3 times that, but, you know, I look like I'm 12. And so, you know, I mean, I look younger basically. And, you know, so these guys made a comment as I was walking by, and I just like, you know, kind of walked on, I carried on. But then you know, as I was walking back, I had like my big sunglasses on, which I didn't bring today, shockingly. I almost always have my sunglasses with me, but I had them on. And like I was crying, and then I get back home finally, and I'm just like, you know, doing this with my pillow, like, oh God, you know, and like I feel ridiculous because it's like it really is a small thing, and it didn't kill me. Obviously, they didn't do anything to me. Actually, it was thankfully. Yeah. I mean, you know, it was the middle of the day, fairly safe. But I think the feeling of it was like, you know, God, this was such a small thing for you to do for me, and you did not. So like, what is that about? You know?
Yeah.
Love me.
The statement that you wrote in conclusion to that story, I'm going to read it because I can't summarize it any more beautifully than you did. But you said, God would not provide peaceful circumstances under the guise of protection. Instead, I would need to become a person of peace in turbulent circumstances. And wow, that is going to stick with me for a long time, because I feel like the situation you're describing, while familiar to me, may not be familiar to everyone, but I think that that idea of wanting our circumstances to be easy and comfortable and safe and, all these kinds of things that really make us feel more peaceful and comfortable, that's not really what God promises us. Promises, that there's not necessarily that promise of safety and comfort and ease at all times, but how do we become people of peace in the midst of all of the stuff that's swirling around us? I don't know how much like the US political craziness has spilled over to South Africa, but it feels like that is everywhere in my day to day. And I think about what does it look like to be at peace in the midst of that. Do you feel like there's other ways you've kind of seen that play out in your experience, whether in South Africa or other places as well?
I was going to say, I feel like I haven't figured that out yet. And yes, we get the news over here. And yeah, I mean, well, I think in general, everyone around the world
got the news over there.
No, but I mean, I think, everyone around the world is very familiar with what's happening in the US because it affects the rest of the world, So like this morning I was driving and the radio talk show guy is talking about the bombs that were delivered to the Obamas and to Hillary Clinton, et cetera, CNN. And so, it's like up to the minute live news kind of thing about what's going on and what the effects of that will be. And I think, I think that my perspective on what it means to be a person of peace has shifted in the last few years. So I think before I thought it was all like, like being calm and meditating or whatever all the time or something, that sort of more.
I've never been very good at that.
No, I don't think I have either. But I think, some of it is about like, what does it mean to be a peacemaker? What does it mean to actually build peace or create peace, work for peace? Not just in my own circumstances, obviously, but, when circumstances are turbulent around us because there's injustice or oppression or whatever it is. And I know that that's a part of the work you do as well. So I feel like, but some of that is, I think it's, the combination of what does it mean to actually both be internally a person of righteousness as well as to do righteousness. What does it mean to be a person internally of peace as well as to do the work of peace? That I feel like is an ongoing journey.
Definitely. One last question particularly about the book, because I know they mentioned this at the beginning, because it is a book about women of color in missions, but it is not necessarily a book for only women of color to read. And so I'd love for you to kind of speak to who the book is for and what kind of the hope for the book would be for readers.
I mean, I think first and foremost, it is definitely for women of color. It is for women of color who don't see their stories represented most of the time in a lot of books about missions, or about evangelism or whatever it might be, or about justice or whatever. Maybe more about justice actually, but frequently books about missions are about white men. When I think about even kind of my own like heroes in the faith, most of them were white men. Sometimes women, but a lot of white men. And so, white men are great, but, women of color have been doing amazing things and since a long time ago. And so I think this is actually highlight, people whose stories you may not normally hear, people whose stories I think will resonate with a lot of people because they're normal people. They're not kind of celebrities doing like, I don't know, working with like gigantic NGOs necessarily or like with their names in the paper, but they're actually doing the work of like visiting people, going door to door, calling people, et cetera, walking in the marches, whatever. But I think, as you're saying, it's not just for women of color, because I think just as I was influenced by and learned a lot from white men, I think white men and white women and men of color and many others can learn a lot from actually listening to the voices and reading the voices of women of color. So I think that's also who the book is for.
Absolutely. And there are so many excellent essays in this book. One I will mention is by our other mutual friend, Jen Blue. And I was reading that one and just like tearing up because she is just such a powerful woman and such a great writer and just some really beautiful wisdom about motherhood and mission that I was just grateful. Took me back to some of our good old days in LA made me miss that church community that was such a blessing to us. And I'm so thankful that you spent time with me today, Jen. Thanks so much for being willing to share your story and talk a little bit about the book. I encourage everyone to pick it up. I'll put the link also to the book in the comments so that you can get a copy. The book is called Voices Rising, and it is an edited compilation. How do you say that word? I don't know. Compilation, I think, of women of color in mission. So thanks so much, Jen. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Sarah. You too.
Bye.
Bye.